In a dimly lit, isolated parking lot of a rural diner, a young man named Jordan, modest, quiet, and new in town, finds himself subject to an unexpected encounter with prejudice. Police officers, subtly biased and assuming Jordan is up to no good, set his car on fire in a disturbing show of authority. Unbeknownst to them, Jordan is the newly appointed sheriff, and their reckless display backfires as he quietly watches. The story builds on the theme of vulnerability in the face of prejudice, leading to a climactic reveal where an older officer steps in, exposing the injustice and shifting the power dynamic, reinforcing a powerful message of empathy and accountability. The bustling atmosphere of the airport terminal hummed around Jordan, a 17-year-old with a wide smile and an unmistakable air of excitement. His fingers traced the edges of his boarding pass, a slightly crinkled slip of paper that held the promise of adventure. It was his first time flying alone, and he was caught in the thrill of it all. The dizzying array of shops, the chatter from the nearby gates, and the overhead announcements crackling through the speakers. Everywhere, people wheeled luggage, sipped coffee, or tucked into waiting chairs, their hurried lives temporarily paused for this collective journey. He settled himself in an empty seat by gate 14, the plastic cool beneath him. Jordan fidgeted with his backpack, making sure his earbuds, snack bag, and journal were still safely tucked inside. He glanced around with wide eyes, taking in the sights and sounds, trying to absorb every detail, as if this whole scene might vanish at any second. He loved watching the different kinds of people bustling by, an elderly couple leaning on each other, a mom struggling with a toddler's hand in one and a stuffed toy in the other, a group of businessmen tapping briskly on their phones. The world felt vast, and Jordan, dressed in a simple plaid shirt and jeans, felt small yet hopeful, as though he were about to be swept up into something incredible. Lost in his thoughts, he didn't notice the officer standing nearby until he felt the prickle of eyes on him. Jordan glanced up and saw the airport police officer, a man in his mid-40s with a sharp gaze and a stiffly pressed uniform. The man's face was locked in a polite but tight expression, a professional veneer that didn't quite reach his eyes. He seemed to be scanning the crowd, but his gaze lingered a bit too long on Jordan. "Excited for your trip?" the officer asked, his voice light, almost casual, but with an undercurrent of scrutiny. His eyes roamed over Jordan's travel-worn backpack, the frayed straps, and the worn edges, taking stock. "Yes, sir," Jordan replied eagerly, his face breaking into a grin. "It's my first time flying by myself." The officer's eyebrows raised slightly, a hint of skepticism flashing in his gaze. "Going somewhere special?" His tone held an edge, something Jordan couldn't quite place. It was a little too careful, a little too probing, as if he were trying to keep up a professional friendliness but wasn't quite succeeding. Jordan nodded eagerly. "Yeah, I'm going to visit my cousin. He lives in another state." He held up his boarding pass with a proud smile. "I even got a window seat." The officer glanced at the ticket, his mouth pressing into a thin line before his gaze dropped back to Jordan's face, a small flicker of something, disapproval, crossing his features. "I see." He offered a faint smile, but his eyes remained hard, appraising. He looked away, scanning the area again, but his posture remained rigid, positioned just close enough to Jordan to feel invasive. Jordan noticed the officer's watchful presence, but he pushed it to the back of his mind, focusing instead on the thought of takeoff, the idea of looking out the window as the plane lifted into the sky. He'd always wondered how the Earth would look from so high up, whether it would be as breathtaking as he imagined. Jordan pulled out his notebook, flipping to a fresh page, where he began to doodle a sketch of a plane mid-flight, surrounded by clouds and tiny stars. He lost himself in the rhythm of drawing, his tongue poking out in concentration as he tried to capture the shape of the wings. Just as he added a finishing touch, a tiny trail of smoke, the officer's voice interrupted his reverie. "That's a nice drawing," the officer said, his tone flat. He nodded toward the notebook, but his gaze was focused, scrutinizing the sketch as if it were something other than what it was, a simple, innocent image. Jordan smiled, tilting the notebook so the officer could see it better. "Thanks. I like to draw stuff, like planes and cars and stuff that goes fast, I guess." The officer's mouth twitched at the corner, but it wasn't quite a smile. "Interesting hobby," he murmured, glancing around, his expression shifting from polite interest to something harder, as though he were searching for something that wasn't there. Jordan felt a subtle shift in the air, a prickling discomfort in his chest. The officer's tone, once casually friendly, now seemed distant, almost detached. Jordan felt himself shrink a little, unsure why, and glanced down at his drawing, tracing over a line with his pencil to avoid the officer's gaze. He told himself it was nothing, just an overactive imagination, maybe. The officer was just doing his job, after all. After a pause, the officer cleared his throat. "Where's your family?" he asked, his voice soft but insistent. "Oh, they're not here," Jordan replied, his tone faltering slightly. "But my cousin will pick me up on the other side." After a pause, the officer cleared his throat. "Where's your family?" he asked, his voice soft but insistent. "Oh, they're not here," Jordan replied, his tone faltering slightly. "But my cousin will pick me up on the other side." The officer's brow furrowed, his gaze narrowing as he studied Jordan again, a hint of suspicion creeping into his eyes. He adjusted his belt, one hand resting on his holstered radio, fingers tapping lightly against it. "Traveling alone at your age, must be nice to have that freedom." The comment hung in the air, feeling loaded with something unspoken. "Yeah, I guess." Jordan offered a small smile, though the officer's tone made him feel as though he'd done something wrong. He shifted in his seat, clutching his notebook a little tighter. "It's a bit scary too, though." The officer nodded slowly, lips pressed together, his gaze still unwavering. "I see." He paused, as if weighing his words. "Well, make sure you don't get into any trouble." Jordan blinked, taken aback. I won't, sir," he replied, forcing a smile. The words felt heavy on his tongue, as though he were making a promise he didn't understand. The officer's stare remained fixed, his expression inscrutable. Then, as if deciding something, he straightened, adjusting the collar of his uniform. "Good," he said shortly. "Enjoy your flight." He turned on his heel, heading down the terminal, his footsteps fading into the surrounding hum of airport life. Jordan released a breath he didn't know he'd been holding, his shoulders relaxing as the officer disappeared into the crowd. He couldn't quite shake the strange feeling, a knot of discomfort lodged deep in his chest. He didn't understand why the officer's questions had made him feel so uneasy. After all, he was just another traveler, another kid on his way to see family. But still, the officer's tone, the way he'd looked at him, had left Jordan feeling smaller somehow, as though a shadow had passed over his excitement. He shrugged it off, deciding not to dwell on it, and returned to his notebook, sketching with renewed focus. As he added more details to his drawing, the announcement finally came for boarding, and Jordan's excitement rekindled, a fresh spark dispelling the lingering shadows of doubt. He tucked his notebook into his backpack, stood up, and joined the line, his heart racing with anticipation once more. He told himself it was nothing, just nerves, perhaps, or maybe the officer was simply having a long day. But even as he took his seat on the plane and settled by the window, his thoughts drifted back to the officer's cold, appraising eyes, the polite but firm barrier that had suddenly seemed to spring up between them. And in the back of his mind, a small, uncertain question lingered, hinting at the emotional conflict waiting to unfold. In the small waiting area near Gate 14, the officer circled back after a quick patrol of the terminal. Jordan was absorbed in his sketching again, leaning forward with focused eyes, his fingers smudged faintly with pencil lead. When the officer cleared his throat, Jordan looked up, startled but polite, instinctively straightening up and clutching his notebook close to his chest, a flicker of confusion and unease crossing his face. "Still here, I see," the officer remarked, his tone friendly enough on the surface, but with an unmistakable edge. He gestured toward the seat beside Jordan, giving him a look that suggested he'd be sitting there regardless of Jordan's response. Jordan shifted, nodding slightly, unsure of what to say. "Yes, sir. Just waiting for boarding," Jordan replied, keeping his voice light. He held his notebook a little tighter, the leather-bound cover suddenly feeling comforting in his hands. "Flying alone, that's quite the responsibility," the officer said, crossing his arms and leaning back, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. Not many kids your age get that privilege. He said the last word slowly, as if the idea of Jordan having any kind of privilege was something difficult to grasp. Jordan blinked, the comment throwing him off guard. Yeah, I guess I'm pretty lucky," he replied softly, offering a small smile. His stomach twisted slightly as the officer's gaze lingered on him a bit too long, scrutinizing, as though weighing his response for some unspoken challenge. The officer let out a dry chuckle. "Must be nice to have family who can trust you that much." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his eyes narrowing as they scanned Jordan's face, studying every feature. "Where are you from, son?" Jordan hesitated, the officer's stare pressing down on him, making him feel strangely exposed. "I'm from a small town, actually, not too far from here." The officer hummed, nodding, but his expression was unreadable. "Not many kids your age traveling out of small towns on their own. You don't seem like the type." His voice held a faintly condescending tone, as though he couldn't quite believe someone like Jordan had any reason to be there alone. Jordan forced a smile, his fingers tightening around the edge of his notebook, knuckles turning white as he resisted the urge to look away. "My cousin lives out of state, and well, I've been looking forward to visiting him," he said, feeling his voice falter slightly under the officer's unyielding gaze. The officer nodded, his mouth set in a thin line. "Well, I suppose it's good to broaden your horizons. Must be quite different from what you're used to." He chuckled, but it didn't reach his eyes, which remained fixed on Jordan, cold and appraising. Jordan felt a pang of discomfort, a heavy weight settling in his chest. He couldn't understand why the officer's words felt so dismissive, so subtly undermining, as though every polite phrase had an undertone meant to make him feel small. He fidgeted slightly, shifting his backpack closer to his feet, as if it might shield him from the scrutiny. The officer's gaze flicked to the backpack and then back to Jordan, his lips curling slightly in a knowing smile. "What's in the bag? Anything interesting?" His tone was light, almost teasing, but it made Jordan's stomach clench. "Just my notebook, some snacks," Jordan replied, feeling a pang of embarrassment as he realized how ordinary his belongings were. He unzipped the bag slightly, holding it open to show the officer, hoping to quell any suspicion. But as he glanced up, he noticed the officer's gaze had a different quality now, a faint trace of disdain, as though Jordan's simplicity somehow confirmed his assumptions. The officer made a show of inspecting the contents, nodding with an exaggeratedly slow smile. "Well, aren't you prepared?" He laughed, but the sound was empty, more mocking than warm. Jordan's cheeks flushed, his grip on the notebook tightening as he felt a strange, creeping sense of vulnerability. He couldn't put his finger on it, but something about the officer's tone, polite on the surface yet subtly biting, made him feel exposed, as though he were being dissected in plain view. For the officer, the interaction was unfolding exactly as he'd expected. He saw Jordan as an inexperienced kid, out of place, maybe even a bit suspicious. He'd come across enough travelers to know who belonged and who didn't, and something about this kid set off a sense of superiority within him. He felt a slight satisfaction at the way Jordan squirmed under his gaze, as though confirming his silent assumptions about young people who didn't fit neatly into his idea of a responsible traveler. There was something too wide-eyed, too eager, about Jordan's expression, a naivety that, to the officer, felt misplaced, deserving of being put in check. "Mind if I ask what you're drawing?" the officer asked, his tone lighter, but with an edge that made it clear he wasn't asking out of genuine interest. Jordan hesitated, the question catching him off guard. "It's just a plane. I like drawing things that go fast," he replied, trying to keep his voice steady. He held up the notebook, the sketch of the plane now seeming almost too simple, too childish under the officer's scrutinizing stare. The officer's mouth twisted into a small smirk, his eyes flicking over the drawing with what felt like feigned amusement. "Interesting choice," he remarked, his tone carrying a hint of derision. "Planes, cars, is that all you're interested in?" Jordan's smile faltered, a faint flicker of confusion crossing his face. "I guess, yeah, I like things that move. I think they're fascinating." He tried to keep his voice light, but the officer's tone was making him feel as though his interests were somehow laughable. The officer leaned back, arms crossed, a faintly superior gleam in his eye. Well, I suppose there's something to be said for keeping things simple. Not everyone has refined tastes. He glanced at Jordan, his eyes narrowing slightly as though challenging him to respond. Jordan's grip on the notebook tightened further, his fingers pressing into the worn leather cover as he forced himself to smile, though it felt strained, hollow. The officer's words stung in a way he couldn't quite understand, each remark laced with a subtle dismissal that made him feel smaller, less worthy. He could sense something unspoken in the air, a tension that felt both personal and distant, as though he were being judged on criteria he didn't fully understand. Internally, Jordan grappled with a growing sense of isolation. He'd expected this trip to be an adventure, a step into the unknown, filled with excitement. But here, under the officer's cold gaze, he felt exposed, as though every innocent gesture, every small joy, were being scrutinized and dismissed. The officer's politeness felt like a mask, concealing a quiet disdain that he couldn't ignore. For the officer, however, the exchange was satisfying. He felt a faint sense of triumph at Jordan's visible discomfort, a silent confirmation that his assumptions had been correct. In his mind, he saw himself as the wiser, experienced figure, putting a naive young kid in his place. He took pride in his ability to read people, to sense when someone didn't quite fit. Jordan's wide-eyed enthusiasm, his simple sketchbook, and his fumbling attempts at polite conversation only served to reinforce the officer's sense of superiority. The kid was harmless, yes, but harmless in a way that, to the officer, felt almost laughably insignificant. "So, no family with you today?" the officer asked, leaning forward, his voice low but insistent. "Pretty bold move, taking off all by yourself." Jordan swallowed, feeling his stomach twist. "Yeah, I guess it's a little scary, but I think it'll be okay." He forced a smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. His fingers tightened around his notebook once more, the familiar texture grounding him as he struggled to hold onto the excitement that had once filled him. The officer nodded slowly, his gaze unrelenting. "Well, I suppose some people are just more adventurous than others." His tone was light, but the words carried a hint of condescension, as though Jordan's decision to travel alone was something to be questioned rather than admired. Jordan glanced down, his cheeks flushing as he clutched his notebook even tighter, the leather edges pressing into his palm. He felt a growing sense of vulnerability, a discomfort that went beyond the officer's words. In that moment, he felt isolated, cut off from the busy hum of the terminal, as though he were the only one being watched, assessed, and subtly dismissed. The excitement he'd once felt seemed to dim, replaced by a heavy knot of uncertainty and confusion. The officer's gaze remained fixed, his expression unreadable as he studied Jordan one last time, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. He straightened, casting a final glance over the young traveler, satisfied that he'd made his point. "Well, enjoy your trip," he said, his tone brisk, dismissive. "Stay out of trouble." He turned and walked away, leaving Jordan alone, clutching his notebook, feeling more vulnerable and isolated than he ever had before. Jordan tried to refocus on his sketchbook, but his thoughts whirled, disrupting the peaceful concentration he'd clung to before. The officer's cutting remarks lingered in his mind, and each detail of their exchange felt etched into his memory. He forced himself to breathe deeply, trying to shake off the unease, but the terminal seemed to close in around him, the busy hum of travelers now a backdrop to his growing anxiety. Before he could fully settle, the officer returned, striding over with a brisk, purposeful walk. Jordan felt his stomach drop, his fingers instinctively curling tighter around his notebook. This time, the officer's expression held no pretense of politeness. His eyes narrowed, and his lips were set in a thin, disapproving line. "Still here, are you?" The officer's voice held an edge, sharper than before. He didn't wait for a response as he took another sweeping look at Jordan, the faintest sneer flickering across his face. "Yes, sir," Jordan replied, his voice barely above a whisper. He tried to maintain eye contact, but the intensity of the officer's gaze made him look away, his heart beating faster as he sensed the change in tone. The officer let out a low, derisive chuckle. I think you'd have somewhere to go by now. Or are you just planning on loitering here all day? His tone dripped with disdain, each word slicing into Jordan, making him feel small, as though he were somehow intruding. No, I just waiting, Jordan managed, swallowing hard as he forced himself to hold on to his composure. He wanted to explain himself, to justify why he was there, but the officer's gaze was unyielding, and he sensed that no answer would be good enough. Waiting, huh? The officer's voice rose, drawing glances from nearby passengers who quickly averted their eyes. Listen, kid, you're taking up space in a busy terminal, and you don't exactly look like someone who belongs here. Maybe you should find somewhere else to wait. Jordan felt a wave of confusion and embarrassment wash over him, his cheeks flushing as he searched for words. He opened his mouth, but the officer cut him off. Didn't your parents teach you any better? The officer's voice was louder now, attracting more attention, though the bystanders kept their heads down, avoiding eye contact. A few people exchanged glances, their expressions a mixture of discomfort and curiosity, but no one intervened. Jordan's throat tightened, his heart pounding as he felt everyone's silent gaze on him. The officer's words felt like a slap, each one adding to the growing knot of fear and shame in his chest. He struggled to understand why he was being singled out, why his presence seemed to provoke such hostility. He could feel himself shrinking under the weight of the officer's glare, the once busy terminal now feeling cold and unwelcoming. Are you even supposed to be here? The officer's words were harsh, almost sneering. He glanced down at Jordan's backpack with a look of suspicion, his eyes narrowing as though searching for something incriminating. You've been sitting here for quite some time, haven't you? Jordan felt his cheeks flush again, the shame mingling with confusion. He clutched his notebook even tighter, feeling its edges dig into his palm, grounding him as he tried to make sense of the hostility being directed at him. I have a ticket, he murmured, his voice barely audible, his eyes fixed on the floor as he fought the urge to disappear. Oh, a ticket, huh? The officer's voice was mocking, his words laced with disbelief. He looked around as though inviting the other travelers to join in his amusement, his laugh echoing through the terminal. Well, isn't that something? A kid like you, with a ticket to fly all on his own? Jordan swallowed hard, his vision blurring slightly as he felt the stares of the nearby passengers. He glanced up briefly, catching the eyes of a woman sitting nearby who looked away quickly, her expression tense. Another man glanced in their direction, shifting uncomfortably but making no move to intervene. The silence of the bystanders seemed to press down on him, amplifying his sense of isolation and helplessness. The officer took a step closer, his gaze hard and unyielding. If you're so eager to prove you're supposed to be here, let's see that ticket, he demanded, holding out his hand expectantly. Jordan hesitated, feeling his stomach twist as he reached for his backpack. His fingers fumbled as he searched for the ticket, the officer's unrelenting gaze making him feel clumsy and panicked. His hands shook as he finally pulled out the crumpled ticket, holding it out with a trembling hand. The officer snatched it, glancing at it briefly, before giving a dismissive snort. Well, what do you know? Guess you do have one. He tossed the ticket back to Jordan, who caught it awkwardly, his face flushing with a mix of relief and lingering shame. But that doesn't mean you can just loiter around here, making everyone uncomfortable. Jordan's heart sank, the brief sense of relief vanishing as quickly as it had come. He clutched his ticket, feeling its crumpled edges against his palm as he tried to hold on to some semblance of control. The officer's words cut into him, each one reinforcing the unspoken accusation that he was somehow out of place, that he didn't belong. A nearby woman shifted in her seat, glancing over with a faint frown before looking away, her expression tight with discomfort. Jordan caught her eye briefly, a flicker of sympathy there, but it vanished just as quickly as she turned her gaze elsewhere, unwilling to involve herself in the tension. Jordan's thoughts churned as he sat there, feeling the officer's scrutiny like a physical weight pressing down on him. The excitement and anticipation that had once filled him now felt hollow, replaced by a growing sense of fear and betrayal. He couldn't understand why he was being treated this way, why his mere presence seemed to provoke such hostility. Each harsh word, Each dismissive look made him feel smaller, more isolated, as though he were shrinking under the weight of the officer's contempt. The officer folded his arms, his gaze unwavering as he studied Jordan with a look of barely veiled disdain. "I've seen plenty of kids like you," he muttered, his voice low but laced with a sneer. "Think they can go wherever they want, do whatever they please, without a thought for anyone else." Jordan's fingers tightened around his notebook, his knuckles white as he fought the urge to respond, to defend himself. But the words caught in his throat, choked by the growing knot of fear and confusion. He felt a surge of anger and frustration, but it was overshadowed by a deep sense of helplessness, a realization that no matter what he said, it wouldn't make a difference. The officer leaned in closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "If I were you, I'd think twice about drawing so much attention. You never know who might take an interest." Jordan's heart pounded, a cold sweat breaking out as the officer's words hung in the air, a thinly veiled threat that sent a chill down his spine. He looked down, his gaze fixed on his notebook as he fought to keep his breathing steady, the fear gnawing at him like a weight pressing down on his chest. Around him, the passengers sat in tense silence, their expressions carefully neutral, avoiding his gaze as though his discomfort were something contagious. A man nearby glanced over briefly, a flicker of sympathy in his eyes, but he quickly looked away, his shoulders hunched as he buried himself in his phone. Jordan felt a pang of loneliness, the isolation sharpening as he realized that no one was going to intervene, that he was alone in facing the officer's hostility. His thoughts raced, a swirl of confusion and fear as he struggled to understand why he was being treated this way, why his presence seemed to provoke such animosity. In that moment, he felt the weight of the officer's prejudice bearing down on him, a silent but powerful force that sought to belittle him, to make him feel small and insignificant. The realization hit him like a blow, a painful understanding that no amount of politeness or compliance would protect him from the officer's contempt. He glanced up, his eyes meeting the officer's, a flicker of defiance sparking within him. But the officer's gaze was cold, unyielding, a silent reminder of the power he held, a power that Jordan could not challenge. He looked away, the spark of defiance quickly extinguished as he sank back into his seat, clutching his notebook tightly, the once familiar comfort now feeling hollow and distant. As the officer turned to leave, he cast one last look over his shoulder, a faint smirk on his face, as though satisfied with the effect of his words. Jordan watched him go, a knot of anger and fear twisting in his chest, his mind reeling as he tried to make sense of the encounter, the once exciting trip now tainted by a sense of betrayal and vulnerability. Around him, the passengers resumed their conversations, their glances and whispers a constant reminder of his isolation. Jordan's heart pounded, the realization settling in that he was alone, that no one would come to his defense. The excitement and wonder that had once filled him now felt like a distant memory, overshadowed by the harsh reality of the officer's words, a reality that left him feeling small, powerless, and utterly alone. The terminal's bustling activity continued around Jordan, his thoughts still reeling from the officer's hostility. He tried to focus on his surroundings, grounding himself in the small, familiar things that had once filled him with excitement. The hum of the intercom, the clinking of rolling luggage, and the distant laughter of travelers all blended together, a cacophony that normally would have given him comfort, but now felt strangely distant, like he was watching from behind a glass wall. Then, through the blur of anxiety and exhaustion, he saw a familiar face, a tall, composed figure striding through the crowd with an unyielding purpose. His father, Sheriff Lewis. Even at a distance, there was no mistaking the way he carried himself, his presence radiating authority and reassurance. Jordan's eyes widened, his heart soaring with a sudden wave of relief. He stood up, clutching his notebook tightly, as though afraid the sense of safety might slip away if he let go. Sheriff Lewis spotted him and immediately quickened his pace, his expression shifting from calm to one of concern as he saw Jordan's distressed face. He reached him in a few long strides, placing a comforting hand on Jordan's shoulder. "Jordan, are you all right?" His father's voice was steady but laced with worry, his gaze scanning Jordan's face as if searching for signs of what had happened. Jordan managed a nod, his throat tight as he tried to find the words to explain. But before he could speak, his father's attention was drawn to the officer, who had noticed their reunion and was now watching with a mixture of surprise and unease. "Is there a problem here?" Sheriff Lewis's voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable edge to it, a quiet authority that carried a warning. He turned to the officer, his gaze steady, as though he were weighing the man's very character with a single look. The officer's initial surprise quickly faded, replaced by an air of defensive arrogance. He cleared his throat, his posture shifting as he folded his arms across his chest, trying to project confidence. "No problem, sir," he replied curtly, glancing at Jordan with a barely concealed sneer. "Just making sure everyone here follows the rules." Jordan's father raised an eyebrow, his gaze narrowing slightly as he took in the officer's demeanor. "Rules?" he repeated, his tone neutral but challenging. He looked down at Jordan, noticing the way his son's hands clutched his notebook tightly, the tension in his posture, the faint redness around his eyes. The officer shrugged, giving a dismissive wave. "You know how kids can be. They sit around, taking up space, and it's my job to ensure the terminal stays safe and orderly." He flashed a forced smile, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes as he met Sheriff Lewis's unyielding gaze. Sheriff Lewis remained silent for a moment, his expression inscrutable. Then he turned to Jordan, his tone gentle but firm. "Jordan, did this officer say something to you?" Jordan hesitated, glancing nervously at the officer, who shot him a warning look. But the warmth in his father's eyes, the reassurance in his presence, gave him the courage to nod. He told me I shouldn't be here," Jordan whispered, his voice barely audible, his gaze dropping to the floor as he felt the weight of the officer's hostility pressing down on him again. Sheriff Lewis's jaw tightened, his expression hardening as he looked back at the officer, his gaze now cold and piercing. "Is that so?" he said quietly, his voice a low rumble that sent a shiver down Jordan's spine. The officer shifted uncomfortably, his earlier arrogance beginning to waver under the sheriff's intense scrutiny. The officer cleared his throat again, attempting to regain his composure. "Look, sir," he said, his tone defensive, "I was just doing my job, making sure this young man wasn't causing any trouble." Sheriff Lewis's gaze didn't waver, his expression a mix of disbelief and controlled anger. "So, you decided that my son, who was sitting quietly, minding his own business, looked like trouble?" The officer opened his mouth, but no words came out. He glanced around, as if searching for some support from the nearby travelers who had been watching the exchange with growing interest. But their gazes were now focused intently on Sheriff Lewis, their silent complicity from earlier replaced by curiosity and, perhaps, a sense of vindication as they witnessed the unfolding confrontation. "Do you realize who you're speaking to?" the sheriff continued, his voice calm but laced with steel. "I'm Sheriff Lewis, and Jordan here is my son." His words were simple, but they held a weight that hung heavy in the air, a power shift that the officer could not ignore. The officer's face paled, his bravado crumbling as the realization of his mistake settled in. He took a step back, his posture shrinking under the weight of the sheriff's gaze. I didn't know, sir," he stammered, his earlier arrogance replaced by a nervous humility as he tried to mask his unease. Sheriff Lewis took a step forward, closing the distance between them, his eyes fixed on the officer with an intensity that left no room for argument. "And that's exactly the problem, isn't it?" he said, his voice low but powerful. "You assumed, without any evidence, that my son was a threat. You decided that he didn't belong here, simply because he didn't fit your idea of who should be in this terminal." The officer's face flushed, his gaze darting around as he struggled to find an escape from the scrutiny bearing down on him. "Sir, I didn't mean any disrespect. I was just trying to do what?" Sheriff Lewis interrupted, his tone sharp and unyielding. "To belittle a young man, to humiliate him in front of strangers, simply because you could? Is that what you consider doing your job?" Jordan watched in silence, a mix of relief and awe washing over him as he listened to his father's words. For the first time since the encounter had begun, he felt a sense of safety, a reassurance that he wasn't alone in facing the officer's hostility. He looked up at his father, a faint smile breaking through his earlier fear as he realized that justice, long overdue, was finally being served. The officer's composure was unraveling, his shoulders slumping as he struggled to respond, his earlier confidence now reduced to a feeble murmur. I was just trying to maintain order," he muttered, his voice barely audible. Sheriff Lewis's gaze hardened, his tone dropping to a low, measured intensity that left no room for misinterpretation. "Order," he repeated, his voice filled with contempt. "You were trying to assert your authority over a young man who posed no threat, who was simply waiting like any other traveler. And you used that authority to belittle and intimidate him, to make him feel like he didn't belong." The officer looked down, unable to meet the sheriff's gaze as the full weight of his actions settled over him. Around them, the passengers watched in silence, their expressions a mixture of satisfaction and discomfort as they witnessed the officer's downfall. Sheriff Lewis turned to the nearby travelers, addressing them with a calm, commanding tone. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the disruption," he said, his voice carrying a quiet authority that demanded respect. "But I believe it's important that we don't tolerate this kind of behavior, especially in a place meant to be safe and welcoming for all." A few passengers nodded, murmurs of agreement rippling through the crowd as they acknowledged the sheriff's words. The tension in the air began to dissipate, replaced by a sense of resolution, of justice having been served. Turning back to the officer, Sheriff Lewis gave him a final, piercing look. "I hope you understand the gravity of what you've done here," he said, his tone firm. "And I trust you'll think twice before treating anyone else with the same disrespect you showed my son." The officer nodded, his face pale and his gaze lowered as he mumbled an apology, his once confident demeanor now a shadow of itself. He shuffled away, his shoulders slumped as he disappeared into the crowd, leaving behind a palpable sense of relief and closure. Sheriff Lewis turned to Jordan, his expression softening as he placed a reassuring hand on his son's shoulder. "Are you all right?" he asked gently, his voice filled with warmth and concern. Jordan nodded, a small smile breaking through his earlier fear as he looked up at his father. "Yeah, I'm okay," he replied, his voice steady as he felt a renewed sense of strength and security in his father's presence. The sheriff smiled, ruffling Jordan's hair affectionately as he guided him back to their seats. "Good," he said softly. "And remember, son, no one has the right to make you feel like you don't belong. You have every right to be here, just like anyone else." Jordan's smile grew, his earlier anxiety fading as he took comfort in his father's words. He glanced around the terminal, the once intimidating crowd, now feeling familiar and welcoming, as though a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. The justice he had longed for had finally been delivered, and with it came a newfound confidence, a reminder that he was not alone in facing the world's challenges. As they sat together, Sheriff Lewis's arm around his shoulders, Jordan felt a quiet sense of gratitude, a warmth that filled him with a renewed sense of belonging. The terminal was no longer a place of fear and hostility, but a space where justice had triumphed, a place where he was finally, undeniably, safe. The tension that had filled the terminal slowly faded, replaced by murmurs from the bystanders who had watched the encounter unfold. For a moment, all eyes remained on the officer as he stood alone, his face flushed with embarrassment and frustration, his authority stripped bare. His earlier confidence had vanished, replaced by a lingering dread as he glanced around, fully aware of the consequences he might face for his actions. A woman in her 40s stepped forward, her expression one of quiet determination. She adjusted the strap of her bag and addressed Sheriff Lewis with a respectful nod. "I saw everything, sir," she said clearly, her voice carrying across the now-hushed terminal. "That officer had no right to treat your son like that." Others began to chime in, nodding their agreement, their initial silence now broken by a sense of moral duty. A young father with a toddler in his arms spoke up next, his eyes narrowing as he glanced at the officer. "That was uncalled for. No kid should have to go through that just for sitting and waiting. It wasn't right." As more bystanders expressed their support, the officer's face grew pale, his shoulders slumping further with each statement. His eyes darted around, seeking an exit from the mounting judgment, but there was nowhere to hide from the collective disapproval of the crowd. Sheriff Lewis watched the scene unfold with a calm, measured gaze. He offered each person who stepped forward a nod of gratitude, his respect for their courage evident in his steady, appreciative expression. Then, turning back to the officer, he addressed him with quiet authority. "You're going to stay right here until your supervisor arrives," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "We'll be reporting this incident in full." The officer stammered, trying to regain some semblance of control. "Sir, please, I didn't mean..." But his words trailed off, his earlier bravado completely dissolved in the face of the repercussions. Within minutes, a senior officer arrived, alerted by one of the terminal staff who had observed the altercation. As he approached, he took in the scene, the watchful crowd, the anxious expressions, and finally, the defeated look on his subordinate's face. He turned to Sheriff Lewis, a look of professional courtesy mixed with regret in his eyes. "Sheriff Lewis," he greeted him respectfully, nodding in acknowledgement. "I'm sorry to hear about what happened. I assure you, this will be handled appropriately." The senior officer then turned to the crowd, addressing them with a calm but authoritative voice. "Thank you all for stepping forward. If anyone wishes to provide a statement about what they witnessed, please see the staff at the terminal desk. Your support in ensuring fairness is appreciated." A few bystanders nodded, already heading toward the terminal desk to give their accounts. The woman who had first spoken stepped up, her voice resolute. "I'll give my statement," she said firmly. "This shouldn't happen to anyone, especially a child." As the senior officer escorted the subdued officer away, murmurs of approval rippled through the crowd. People exchanged glances of satisfaction, a sense of vindication settling over them as they recognized that justice was indeed being served. Sheriff Lewis knelt down to Jordan's level, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. His voice was gentle but firm, filled with warmth and pride. "Jordan, you did nothing wrong. What happened back there, it wasn't about you. It was about someone who thought he could use his position to make others feel small." Jordan's eyes shimmered with a mix of relief and lingering confusion, the weight of the experience still pressing on him. "But why did he do that, Dad?" he asked quietly, his voice tinged with the innocence of someone grappling with the unfairness of the world for the first time. His father's expression softened, and he pulled Jordan into a comforting embrace. "Sometimes, people let their own biases cloud their judgment," he explained gently. "They assume things about others based on nothing more than appearances. It's not right, and it's not fair. But what matters is that people like you and me, and the people who stepped forward, don't let them get away with it. We stand up for what's right." Jordan leaned into the embrace, feeling the warmth of his father's words sink in, each one a balm to the rawness left by the officer's cruelty. The lingering discomfort began to melt away, replaced by a profound sense of security, of knowing that he was not alone, that there were people who cared and who would stand by him when he needed them most. After a moment, Sheriff Lewis released him, a gentle smile playing on his face. "You see those people?" he said, nodding toward the bystanders who were still speaking with the terminal staff. "They saw what happened, and they chose to speak up. They're a reminder that kindness and fairness can shine through, even in difficult times." Jordan looked over, his heart swelling with gratitude for each person who had stepped forward. He gave his father a small nod, feeling the lesson settle deeply within him, the understanding that while there were people who might treat him unfairly, there were others who would stand by him, lifting him up when he needed it most. "Dad," he said softly, his voice filled with quiet determination, "I want to be like you. I want to stand up for people too." Sheriff Lewis's eyes softened, his pride evident as he placed a hand on Jordan's shoulder. "You already are, son," he replied with a warm smile. "Standing up doesn't always mean confronting someone. Sometimes, it just means refusing to let others make you feel small. It means showing compassion and empathy no matter what." The terminal had returned to its usual rhythm, passengers moving to their gates, announcements echoing over the intercom. But for Jordan, the experience lingered, filling him with a newfound strength, a determination to carry forward the lesson he had learned. As they made their way toward the exit, Jordan glanced back one last time, taking in the bustling scene that had become the backdrop to his experience. His gaze shifted to the bystanders, some of whom gave him encouraging nods and small waves, their supportive expressions reinforcing the comfort his father had instilled in him. In that moment, he understood the power of standing together, the strength in unity, and in refusing to let injustice go unchallenged. The memory of the officer's hostility faded, replaced by the warmth of his father's embrace, the kindness of strangers, and the reassuring message that fairness, respect, and empathy could prevail, even in the face of prejudice. With a final look at his father, who walked beside him with quiet pride, Jordan felt a renewed sense of purpose. Today, he had learned that respect and fairness were not just words but values to uphold and protect. And he knew, with unwavering certainty, that he would carry this lesson forward, letting it guide him in his own journey of kindness, strength, and empathy. Sheriff Lewis sat alone at his desk in the quiet of his office, the events of the day replaying in his mind. Outside, dusk was settling, casting a soft glow through the window. The world beyond his office felt peaceful now, but his thoughts were anything but at ease. He thought back to the look in Jordan's eyes, a mixture of fear and confusion that no child should ever have to experience. The incident had left an indelible mark on him, a reminder of the real work he needed to do not just as a father, but as a leader. He picked up a pen, jotting down ideas for changes he wanted to see in his department. Jordan's experience had exposed a painful truth. Authority, when unchecked and biased, could harm the very people it was meant to protect. Lewis knew that his responsibility went beyond addressing one incident. He had to address the entire structure that allowed this incident to happen in the first place. Accountability, he wrote, underlining the words several times. His mind buzzed with potential policies, mandatory bias and empathy training for officers, a clear process for reporting inappropriate conduct, and regular community feedback sessions to keep a pulse on how his department was serving or failing to serve the people it was sworn to protect. Each idea felt like a step toward building an environment where respect and fairness weren't just goals, but guiding principles embedded in daily practice. After a moment of silence, Lewis heard a soft knock on his door. "Come in," he called, and a moment later, Jordan stepped inside, looking both curious and pensive. Lewis smiled, gesturing for him to sit in the chair across from his desk. "Hey, champ," Lewis said, leaning forward with a warm, fatherly gaze. "How are you feeling?" Jordan hesitated, fidgeting slightly with his hands. "I'm okay, Dad," he replied softly, though his eyes betrayed a lingering sadness. "It was a lot to handle today." Lewis nodded, his heart heavy as he absorbed his son's words. "I know it was, son. I'm sorry you had to go through that. But I want you to know something. You showed incredible bravery today. Facing that officer and everything he threw at you, it took real strength. I couldn't be prouder of you." A faint smile crossed Jordan's lips, though his eyes were still thoughtful. "I just didn't understand why he was so mean," he murmured, looking down. "All I was doing was waiting. And then everyone started watching, but no one did anything at first. It was like no one cared." Sheriff Lewis reached across the desk, placing a comforting hand on his son's shoulder. "Sometimes people stay silent because they're afraid or because they think someone else will step in," he explained gently. "But that doesn't mean they don't care. Today, they needed someone to show them that standing up for what's right isn't just important, it's necessary. And you were that someone, Jordan. You didn't back down. And that's something few people have the courage to do." Jordan looked up, his eyes meeting his father's with a newfound determination. "So, does that mean it'll be different from now on? That people will care more?" Lewis took a deep breath, his gaze firm as he nodded. "Yes, son, that's exactly what it means. I'm going to make sure that no one, child or adult, has to feel powerless in the face of prejudice. I'm implementing changes to protect everyone who walks through our doors. Changes that will make it clear that we are a place of safety and respect." Jordan tilted his head, curiosity sparking in his eyes. "Like what?" "Well," Lewis said, leaning back thoughtfully, For starters, we're going to bring in training programs that focus on empathy and accountability. Officers will have to go through these programs regularly to keep their biases in check and remind them of the values they're supposed to uphold. We'll also be creating a way for people to report any misconduct anonymously so that everyone feels safe and heard. And we'll invite members of the community to give us feedback regularly. This isn't just about our department. It's about building trust across the board. Jordan seemed to take in his father's words, his face thoughtful. After a moment, he asked, "Will that really change how people act?" Lewis nodded confidently. "It's not going to happen overnight, but yes, it will. When people know they're accountable, they think twice about their actions. And when the whole community is involved, it becomes harder to ignore someone's pain or mistreatment. That's how we create a protective sky over everyone. A place where trust is never broken and respect is the rule." Jordan's face softened, his shoulders relaxing. "I like that, Dad," he said quietly, a sense of peace settling over him. Protective skies. It sounds like something that watches over everyone. Lewis smiled, sensing that his son had found a way to understand the lesson in a way that was comforting yet powerful. "Exactly. And today, you were brave enough to stand under that sky, even when it felt dark." Bravery isn't about never being afraid, Jordan. It's about standing up, even when you are. And you did that. You showed resilience. And I have no doubt you'll continue to do that. Jordan nodded, a newfound sense of pride filling his heart. He straightened up in his chair, the weight of the day's events seeming to lift as he absorbed his father's words. "Thanks, Dad," he whispered. "I won't forget this." Lewis felt a surge of pride, knowing that the experience had not only taught his son about resilience, but had also inspired a sense of responsibility that he hoped would stay with him forever. As they sat together, father and son, he made a silent vow to uphold the changes he had envisioned, to make sure that the world his son grew up in was safer, kinder, and just. In the quiet that followed, Lewis found himself reflecting on the importance of every policy, every decision, and every interaction within his department. If they could foster a culture of empathy, respect, and fairness, then the protective skies he spoke of could extend far beyond the walls of his office. It would be an invisible shield, a promise that no one would be left to face prejudice or cruelty alone. He turned back to Jordan, placing a firm hand on his shoulder once more. "One day, you'll understand just how important it is to stand up for others, to speak up even when it's hard. You may not see it right away, but each time you do, you'll be helping to create that safe, protective sky for someone else." Jordan's eyes filled with understanding, his young face set with a determination that seemed to mirror his father's. "I will, Dad. I'll be brave, just like you." In that moment, Lewis felt a sense of peace settle over him. He knew that the work ahead would be challenging, that systemic change would require patience and resilience. But as he looked into his son's eyes, he realized he wasn't just creating a safer world for today. He was laying the foundation for a future where courage, respect, and compassion would thrive, a world Jordan would one day help to shape and protect. And with that, Lewis rose from his desk, determined to make his vision a reality. Holding his son's hand, he walked out of his office, both of them ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, under skies that would always remain safe, just, and true. Years later, Jordan found himself standing in the renovated community center, now a bright and bustling space filled with local families, police officers, and community leaders gathered for the annual Trust in Action event. It was a new tradition Sheriff Lewis had started as part of his commitment to transparency and community collaboration, a tangible result of the reforms he had set in motion after that fateful day. Jordan, now in his early 20s and radiating a quiet confidence, glanced around, taking in the scene. The open and inviting layout, colorful murals on the walls, and easygoing exchanges between officers and residents made it clear just how much had changed. Sheriff Lewis's reforms had transformed the department from one cloaked in authority to a presence rooted in empathy, fairness, and community partnership. As he helped set up a booth for community feedback, Jordan overheard a young child nearby ask an officer a question about police work, with a mix of curiosity and wonder. The officer bent down to the child's level, answering kindly, without a trace of the defensiveness or superiority Jordan had once encountered. That day had left its mark on him, but it had also led to a world where things could be different. He smiled, feeling a sense of pride in his father's dedication and the real changes it had made. Later, Sheriff Lewis walked over to his son, noticing the thoughtful look in his eyes. "Proud of you, son," he said warmly, placing a supportive hand on Jordan's shoulder. "You helped make this possible." Jordan looked at his father, gratitude and admiration shining in his eyes. "No, Dad. You did," he replied, his voice full of respect. "If you hadn't stood up that day, things might still be the same. You taught me what it means to fight for fairness and to protect people who feel vulnerable." Sheriff Lewis's face softened. "Maybe, but watching you become the strong, resilient person you are now, that's been my reward. That's what this was all for." Jordan nodded, taking a deep breath. "I'll carry that lesson forward, Dad. Thanks to you, I know that standing up for what's right isn't just about speaking out. It's about making sure people never feel alone. I won't forget that." The event continued, filled with laughter, shared stories, and an unspoken trust that had been built over time. Jordan realized that his father's actions had done more than change policies. They had woven a new spirit of empathy into the community's fabric, one that allowed it to heal, connect, and grow. As he gazed at the crowd, Jordan felt a surge of hope and commitment, a desire to carry forward the torch of empathy and justice that his father had passed on. The protective love that had once shielded him was now a promise to those around him. And with that, he knew they were both building a future grounded in fairness, respect, and a deep, unbreakable sense of belonging.